Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents and U.S. history. I've been discussing the Watergate scandal under, President Richard Nixon, and I did an earlier video in which I was providing data, and I showed how, um, you know, Nixon might have expedited the um, desegregation of schools process, and by showing how the proportion, the percentage of black kids who attended segregated schools in 1968, which was at 70%, dropped to about 8% in 1972, you know, at the end of President Nixon's first term. So basically showing, it can create some kind of misrepresentation that Nixon was in favor of advancing civil rights for blacks. In fact, his attorney general um, was impeding civil rights for blacks. Right? He was that's John Mitchell, the only U.S. attorney general to have been convicted for crimes during his tenure, and to have been incarcerated for it. Um, and so just to show how numbers can be misleading. And by the way, Nixon himself was a very, his administration was full of smoke and mirrors. I've been doing videos just showing how there was an initial cover up, right, with the Watergate break in, and which, the president had been denying, you know, any involvement or knowledge of the White House with the Watergate break-in. In fact, on the day the burglary occurred, June 17, that it was the second one, actually, the second break-in. This is the one that they were caught. June 17, 20. Sorry, it was June 17, 1972. So the 54th anniversary is coming up in just a month, right, of the Watergate break-in. President Richard Nixon was in Florida at the time, and he described it as a third-rate burglary, and he said, the he disavowed the White House's knowledge and involvement, and of course they paid hush money to continue to get the burglars who went to trial to commit perjury and continue to deny that there was any involvement of higher ups, or or even the White House, and of course that would eventually lead to the resignation of President Nixon, when of course all of this was contradicted by the evidence supplied by Deep Throat. That was the number 2 official of at the FBI, who was leaking information to the Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And of course, events, you know, unfolded, and the whole scandal was unraveled. But so what I want to do right now is actually to show that, um, contrary to the data of the desegregation of schools, right? Um, Nixon was actually uh, on record demonstrating animus towards blacks, right? The evidence shows that Richard Nixon was very racist against blacks, um, and we see this in a conversation he had with Ronald Reagan in October of 1971. Earlier in February 1971, Richard Nixon, of course, had uh, an automatic, voice activated recording system installed secretly in the White House, which would, record all conversations in the Oval Office, in the White House, on the phones. He had it installed in Camp David as well, and this would, of course, be the smoking gun that showed he'd been lying to the American public. and that his officials, had been committing perjury, um, and ultimately lead to his resignation and downfall. Um, so again, uh, instead of pursuing civil rights for blacks, his Attorney General John Mitchell, which I've done a video on, um, John Mitchell was actually uh, John Mitchell uh, was uh, was not was continuing with the all deliberate speed. So there are other factors that led to the desegregation of schools, right, and created those numbers. That's from 70% of black kids attending segregated schools in 1968 to its decline to 8% in 1972 under President Nixon. There are other factors, and it wasn't Nixon's strategy or Nixon's policies, because Nixon actually he pursued the policy of the Southern strategy, which John Mitchell, his Attorney General, would also execute. The Southern strategy was to try and get white Southerners, right? White Southerners to get come into the Republican tent by appealing to their their racial animus against blacks, right? And so obviously he wasn't going to be uh, embracing any he wasn't going to let his program be a platform for civil rights for blacks. And of course, um, there were there were the uh, the law and order the law and order policy and enforcement by John Mitchell. In fact, his Attorney General John Mitchell, at one time, when he made it clear in a presser that the role of the Department, the Justice Department, was actually a law enforcement agency, and it was not a tool for addressing society's ills. That was what he labeled um, the civil rights movement as. The movement for to achieve civil rights for blacks. He called it society's ills. So um, he mischaracterized it as that. So, and he said the Justice Department was not for that. He forgot, of course, the history of the Justice Department, which was actually created by President Ulysses Grant, and it was actually created to achieve, to protect the civil rights of blacks, of the newly freed black Americans, and protect them against the Ku Klux Klan. So, and to prosecute the Ku Klux Klan. So in any event, what I want to do is I want to go directly into the text and read from the transcript of Richard Nixon's recording of a conversation with Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan can be heard in this phone conversation uh, calling the African delegates at the United Nations monkeys who are not comfortable wearing shoes. And Richard Nixon laughs. He has this large cackle over the phone, and subsequently he was telling his Secretary of State about the conversation, and he 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 remixes Nixon's Ronald Reagan's words. Of course, Ronald Reagan who was governor of California at the time, and of course he would go on to become the 40th U.S. president later on. But Richard Nixon, relaying the conversation to his Secretary of State, then says that Ronald Reagan said he saw those cannibals on television, referring to the African delegates. He saw the cannibals on television, uh, you know, and they weren't and that they weren't wearing shoes, right? So it's just he was a disturbing racist, and he did many other disturbing things. Um, so the context, the reason why this came up, why the African delegates came up, was because at that time the African uh, voting bloc in the United Nations, and they're a large voting bloc. African nations today are 54, but even at that time, their numbers were rising, were increasing, because this was in the aftermath of and it's still in the process of a lot of independence movement, right? It was post major independence movements in the 50s and 60s. Um, the African nations in the UN had um, had supported a UN decision to welcome China, the Republic of China, in the United Nations, and to expel Taiwan. Which, and of course, apparently Nixon and Reagan, were not happy with that, which sort of contradicts Nixon's public image. I remember I read Nixon's memoirs, his autobiography himself when I was a kid, and he projects this image that he was the one who reopened, which he did. He was the first president who went to visit China, and he made it seem like he appeared to be taking credit for rapprochement. That he was pursuing the one actually pursuing rapprochement with China, right? Meanwhile, again, it was all a smoke screen. Again, I was just consistent with his double dealing nature. So Nixon was really a double dealer. He was a real cloak and dagger character, and we see this in other things he was doing. Especially with the plumbers. That's the White House Special Investigation Unit that he created to actually conduct espionage and sabotage on his enemies, on his democratic rivals. But right now, let me get into the conversation. And again, this is in the conversation between Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon was with respect to African nations who supported the UN decision to welcome um, China into the United Nations and to expel Taiwan. And again, this is consistent with what's even going on again in modern times. Recently, I don't mean to digress, March 25, 2026, right, earlier this year, the 54 nations, there were over 120 votes, I think 123 votes, but the majority, of course, were from the African nations, which are 54 in the United Nations, and of course, Caribbean nations. Um, they passed a UN resolution declaring the transatlantic slave trade and chattel enslavement of Africans, based on racial chattel enslavement of Africans, as the gravest crime against humanity, right? And of course, America was one of the nations to abstain, right? I mean, they didn't even just abstain. I think they dissented, right? They voted no. Um, and other European nations abstained. But in any event, let me get to the reading. So this is conversation, right? October 20, the transcript of the excerpt, right? The excerpt is just um, the so the transcript excerpt October 26, 1971, right? Uh, Reagan, right? So this is Reagan speaking. I'm quoting. Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did. Nixon, yeah, that's Nixon speaking now, responding, yeah. Then Reagan goes, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them. they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes. And Nixon gives a large laugh, right? That's it. And then this is from a CNN article, right? It says that following this conversation, Nixon told Secretary of State, I'm quoting CNN transcript, Nixon told Secretary of State William Rogers that Reagan had seen, in quote, those cannibals on television last night and noted that they weren't even wearing shoes, right? So you see, uh, he misstated what he misquoted, mischaracterized exactly what Ronald Reagan said. Although Ronald Reagan said something that was clearly racist, calling Africans, monkeys, but and then Nixon calls them cannibals, and that they actually weren't wearing shoes. It's just it was a terrible person, Nixon, and I'm going to do more videos on how gangster he was. He was so diabolical. He's Attorney General. Uh, the things they did. I'm going to do more videos on the Watergate scandal. I've done a video discussing the Saturday night massacre in which he was trying to obstruct justice and pressure his attorney generals to fire the special prosecutor Archibald Cox, and fortunately they refused and they chose to resign rather than fire this special prosecutor and obstruct justice. So this is from his. Now I'm going to quote from his. So that's how he felt about uh, black, about Africans, right? Now, in terms of black Americans in America, right? Black Americans, we have a quote, an quote alleged quote from John Ehrlichman, who was his White House counsel, right? John Ehrlichman is one of the people who was convicted for obstruction of justice in the Watergate scandal, and he did go to prison, right, for perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy, and I think including conspiracy to defame Daniel Ellsberg. He served about 18 months in prison, and he got disbarred as well. He was a Stanford law graduate, right? He got his law degree from Stanford University. Um, so this was with regard to the drug on war, right? After he got out of prison and he was explaining the war on drugs, how the war on drugs was really a war against Black Americans and hippies, right? Liberals. So let me just read directly from the quotes. I want to try and keep this short and just go directly to it. It's pretty straightforward. What they're saying. Uh, so this is a quote from John Ehrlichman. He goes, "You want to know what this was really all about?" He asked with the bluntness of a man who, after public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison, had little left to protect. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. By the way, Nixon actually had an enemies list, right? He purportedly had and I'll do something about Nixon's enemies list. So anyway, so he's saying, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did, right? So, you see what it says right here. It said, um, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people, right? The anti-war left, those were those they called hippies, right, at the time. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, right? We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news, right? Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did, right? So that's the end of the quote. So that was from John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman was, convicted of for his involvement in the White House, sorry, in the Watergate scandal. Um, so, and you see his attorney general, that's Richard Nixon's attorney general, John Mitchell, who also was convicted, the only U.S. attorney general to be convicted for his acts in office. He would approve no-knock warrants and illegal wiretapping without warrants, right? So they used all sorts of methods um, to violate the civil liberties of Americans and, of course, the civil rights of Black Americans, which they had been advanced under, just been advanced on and won under Nixon's predecessor, President Lyndon B. Johnson. So I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll do more videos just talking about the disastrous administration of President Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.